How's it going, metalheads, and welcome back to another video. Welcome back to yet another album review. In this album review, we have a pretty cool one to go over. We're going to be going over Vortex of the Dark Knowledge by Cranial Osteotomy. This is the first full-length album in 15 years for this brutal death metal crew from Russia. And Cranial Osteotomy are actually one of the bands that I got into brutal death metal with way back in the day. And I'm young, so way back in the day for me means like 4 years ago. But anyway, I was super stoked when I saw this was coming out because, you know, they haven't put out an album in a while, didn't know they were gone. And I really enjoyed their last one, you know, a while ago. So I was super stoked to see that they were putting out new stuff. And I was not disappointed. Immediately after the intro track, which is called Precursor, which is about 50 seconds of like creepy, like synth sample kind of thing, they go straight into skull crushing brutal death, which is complete with guttural vocals, punishing drums, and absolutely gnarly chugging riffs. And this is the style of brutal death that I really enjoy, and I enjoy a lot more than slam, because while the vocals are about the same pitch, especially on this album, as slam, you know, the same kind of really low, like gurgly, they follow a different vocal pattern every time. Whereas slam, you find that there's just the insert vocal here vocal pattern. Like in every slam song, you have the vocals in the same spots. Whereas here, they switch up the tempos and the pace a lot. And you can tell they're actually putting effort into how the songs were written on this album, which I really enjoy more than slam. So while I have no idea what he's saying, because, you know, it's all gurgles and stuff, I can tell that more effort was put into this than is into slam vocals, which is really cool. And I think that it's a really step up from their last album. Their last album had a lot of that kind of just like insert, you know, stock vocal pattern here kind of thing going on. And they were also way less, you could hear way less of like the pitch changes and stuff. It was really just one note on the last album. The vocals also take a bit of a back seat in the mix on this album, which is really good for them. They sort of act like another instrument, which I think is really cool, especially in this style of music. The guitars are also more complex than you'd find in slam, which is why I call this brutal death metal, not slam. I know there's some people who just classify it all, you know, anything with guttural vocals and that kind of thing as slam, but it's really not. You have to draw that line between brutal death and slam, and brutal death is where the complexity comes into the slam. You still find the slow chromatic chugging riffs, obviously, but there's also fast blasty section with tremolos and pinch harmonics and that kind of thing, which differentiate it for me a lot. The pinch harmonics are really nice on this album. They cut through the mix nicely, and they add another layer of complexity to the guitar work, which is already great. You can tell the band worked on a lot of stuff musically in their time away from, you know, the 15-year gap between albums, and it even just feels that way with like the song titles. The last album was very samey, and while it influenced me early on, you know, getting into brutal death metal, looking back on it now, listening to it now, I can see how it's the same as a lot of brutal death that's out right now, especially like, you know, there's a bunch of brutal death metal bands and slam bands, especially from Russia. I have a whole playlist full of just Russian brutal slamming death metal, and so there's a lot of bands from there. But meanwhile, this album really stands out. It feels really well put together. There's enough variety that you can differentiate between the songs, which I think is really cool, which is really hard to do sometimes in brutal death and slam, because there's a lot of, you know, cliches in the genre. And so I think if you can differentiate between songs on an album and say, I like this song versus this song, and know what you're talking about, that's really cool to do on an album. And I think they did a really good job with that. I like this album as a whole way more than the last one. I think they grew a lot in between albums, and I think that's really cool. There's also less of the cliche, like, horror samples at the beginning of the songs, too. You know, and there's a lot of more musical substance on this album. There's definitely a place for the samples in metal, especially, you know, brutal death and slam, but I feel like in brutal death and slam especially, they overuse the horror samples, especially, like, frequently. You know, there's a lot of samples that make sense in other genres, but in brutal death and slam, I feel like it's just the beginning of every song, there's some stupid sample, and it kind of takes away from the music a little bit for me, so I'm glad that they only did really, like, one kind of thing on that, and it's on the intro track, which is really nice. Because if a band only has one intro track instead of like an intro on every song, you can tell they're a lot more about the music and less about what they're trying to put on top of the music. But anyway, all in all, this is a really solid outing of brutal death metal on this album, and one that I highly recommend. If you're into brutal death at all, or slam, definitely give this a listen, because it's probably my top brutal death release of the year to this point. And congrats to the guys on such an awesome comeback album, because I really enjoyed this. And obviously, I'm not a beginner to brutal death. I'm wearing my Abominable Putridity shirt. I love brutal death metal and slam. It's one of my favorite subgenres. And so I know some people don't like it, but I really enjoyed this album, and I really enjoy the genre. So anyway, if you're into that genre, definitely check out Vortex of the Dark Knowledge by Cranial Osteotomy, because it's an awesome album. But yeah, anyway, with that, I hope you're all doing well. Have a nice day. See ya.